The Forgotten Tomb. Sophie sat at her kitchen table, staring at the invitation clutched in her trembling hands. The thin, yellowed paper crackled under her grip, as though it had been passed down through generations of strangers. The ink, though faded, remained disturbingly legible. You are cordially invited to explore the lost tomb of Zoltan, recently uncovered deep in the jungle. Few have seen it. Fewer still have returned. The words seemed to swim on the page, like they weren't meant for her eyes. Her fingers traced the edges of the parchment, which felt oddly alive, warmer than paper should be, pulsing under her touch like old, dry skin stretched over ancient bones. She felt the weight of centuries pressing against her, a presence far older than human memory. For a moment, Sophie considered tossing the invitation away. It was an irrational thought. No seasoned archaeologist would be unnerved by an invitation, even one as mysterious as this. But as she placed the paper on the table, a chill crept over her, snaking up her spine and curling around her neck like a cold hand. Sophie had faced dangers before, collapsing ruins, ancient traps, venomous snakes. But this felt different. It was as though the invitation itself was alive, calling to her with a voice she had never heard, but somehow knew. Deep within her, something ancient and primal stirred, whispering that she should walk away. Yet something else, some darker compulsion, urged her to go. It was like a hunger, gnawing at her from the inside, insatiable and relentless. She couldn't resist. 2 weeks later, Sophie found herself standing at the edge of a remote jungle village, the air thick with oppressive humidity. The villagers had been distant, their eyes avoiding her as though they feared her very presence. The sky overhead was an impenetrable wall of dark clouds, pregnant with the promise of rain that never came. The jungle, lush and overgrown, seemed to creep closer with each passing moment, as though the trees themselves were watching, waiting. Marcus, her guide, stood silently beside her. He was a tall man, his face weathered and creased with years of guiding expeditions through the jungle. But today his usual stoic expression was marred by something else, a quiet, simmering fear. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice low and edged with unease. His eyes darted toward the jungle, scanning the tree-line as though expecting something to emerge. "The villagers, they say the tomb is cursed. It doesn't want to be found. They've lost people to it. Men have gone in, but none came back." Sophie forced a smile, though it felt hollow. "I've heard plenty of stories like that before, Marcus. Superstition to keep people away. I'm here for the history, not the legends." Marcus shook his head, his lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't argue, but the weight of his silence lingered between them, thick as the humid air. He shifted his pack onto his shoulder and gestured toward the dense jungle ahead. "It's your life, but the jungle has a way of changing minds." Sophie followed him into the undergrowth, the narrow trail quickly swallowed by the sprawling vines and thick trees. The air grew heavy, cloying with the smell of damp earth and decaying vegetation. Above them, the canopy of leaves was so dense that it nearly blocked out the sky, casting the world below in a dim green twilight. The jungle was alive with sounds, strange, animalistic cries from deep within the foliage, rustling leaves that seemed to move on their own, and the ever-present hum of unseen insects. But something about it all felt wrong. The sounds were too distant, too fragmented, like echoes from another world. And the trees, massive, ancient things that towered above her, seemed to lean in, as though curious about the intruders in their midst. Sophie tried to focus on her work. She had come here to make history, to uncover a tomb long thought to be a legend. But as they ventured deeper into the jungle, she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Shadows flitted between the trees, and more than once, she had the strange sensation of being watched, eyes on her back, the hairs on her neck prickling with the certainty that something was following. After hours of trudging through the undergrowth, they reached the tomb. It was no ordinary ruin. It loomed ahead of them, half buried in the jungle, its massive stone entrance overgrown with moss and vines. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. The carvings etched into the stone door were grotesque. Faces twisted in eternal agony, their mouths frozen in silent screams, their eyes wide with terror. These weren't the typical glyphs she had studied in ancient tombs. These felt wrong. It was as though the stone itself had captured the souls of the dead, imprisoning them for eternity. The longer she stared, the more it seemed that the faces were watching her, their hollow eyes tracking her every move. Marcus stepped back, crossing himself. "This isn't right," he muttered, his voice tight with fear. "We should leave. Now." But Sophie, despite the gnawing dread building in her chest, couldn't tear her eyes away from the tomb. The carvings seemed to pulse with life, the stone warm to the touch as her fingers traced the ancient symbols. A low, rumbling growl echoed from deep within the tomb, like the sound of something large, something hungry, stirring from its long slumber. The door groaned as Sophie pushed it open. It was massive, far too heavy for one person to move, yet it slid open easily, as though it had been waiting for her, as though the tomb itself was eager to let her in. Darkness yawned beyond the entrance, a thick, suffocating blackness that swallowed the light. The moment they stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening boom. The sound reverberated through the tomb, echoing endlessly, growing louder and louder until it seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. Sophie's flashlight flickered, casting long, twisted shadows on the walls. The corridor they stood in was lined with statues. At first glance, they appeared to be the same grotesque figures as those outside, their faces frozen in expressions of unimaginable pain. But as Sophie's light passed over them, she realized something far worse. The statues weren't stone. They were bodies, mummified and contorted, their flesh dried and stretched tight over their bones, their mouths open in perpetual screams.